In the deep Florida Everglades, there are places where the water doesn't flow and the birds don't sing. I found a hole in the map where the echoes don't just mimic your voice, they steal your face. The humidity in the Florida Everglades doesn't just sit on your skin, it breathes with you. It's a thick, heavy presence that smells of sulfur, decaying sawgrass, and ancient, stagnant water. My name is Elias. I've been an airboat guide for 24 years. I've seen 14-foot gators and pythons thick as a man's thigh. But those are just animals. Animals follow rules. Nature follows laws. But what I encountered last Friday at a place the locals call the Sink doesn't follow anything human. It started at 6 p.m. The sun was a bruised purple on the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows through the mangrove roots. I was heading back to the docks after a solo maintenance run. My boat, the Nightcrawler, was humming along, the giant fan at the back pushing me over the lily pads. But as I passed the bend near Gator's Mouth, the engine coughed. It didn't just stall. It died with a sound like a physical gasp. The silence that followed was terrifying. In the swamp, silence is a lie. There should be the hum of cicadas, the splash of a turtle, the distant grunt of a bullfrog. But as I sat there, the swamp went dead quiet. Even the wind stopped. "Great," I muttered, grabbing my wrench. My own voice sounded small, swallowed by the moss-covered trees. I worked on the engine for 20 minutes, the sweat stinging my eyes. That's when I heard it. A soft, wet splashing coming from the thick mangroves to my left. Splash, pause, splash. It was rhythmic, too rhythmic for a gator. It sounded like someone walking in hip-deep water. "Hey, who's there?" I called out, shining my 10,000 lumen searchlight into the dark roots. The light cut through the fog like a blade. At first, I saw nothing but the tangled, walking roots of the mangroves. Then the light hit something pale. It was a face, but it wasn't right. It was too wide, the skin looking like wet, gray parchment stretched over a skull. And it was tall, at least 7 feet, standing on thin, spindly legs that looked like charred wood. But the worst part wasn't how it looked. It was what it said. "Elias, help me. It's so cold," the thing whispered. My heart stopped. That wasn't just a voice. That was my daughter's voice. My daughter, Maya, who had drowned in these very waters 5 years ago. It was her exact tone, her exact inflection, even the way she used to lisp her S sounds. "Who are you? Stop it," I yelled, my hands shaking so hard I dropped the wrench into the murky water. The creature didn't move. It stood perfectly still, half hidden by a cypress tree. Then its jaw dropped open further than any human jaw should. It didn't have teeth. It had rows of jagged, needle-like bone. "Stop it! Stop it! Who are you?" it repeated. It was mimicking me, but the voice changed. As it spoke, the voice transitioned from Maya's sweet tone into my own deep, gravelly voice. It was like hearing a recording of myself played back by a demon. I scrambled for the starter cord. Pull. Nothing. Pull. Nothing. The creature began to move. It didn't swim. It skittered across the top of the water like a giant water strider. Its movements were jerky, like a broken film reel. It was getting closer. I finally got the engine to spark. The fan roared to life and I didn't wait. I slammed the throttle. The Nightcrawler lurched forward, carving a path through the sawgrass. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just focused on the narrow channel ahead. But the swamp began to change. Places I had known for 20 years looked different. The trees seemed to lean in closer. The fog grew so thick I could barely see 3 feet in front of the bow. My GPS screen was just a mess of static. Then the engine died again. This time I knew it wasn't a mechanical failure. Something was draining the life out of the boat. I drifted into a clearing. In the middle of the clearing, sitting on a rotted log, was me. It was a figure wearing my exact camo jacket, my stained cap, my boots. It was sitting with its back to me. I grabbed my flare gun, my knuckles white. "Turn around," I screamed. The figure slowly rotated its head. It didn't turn its body, just its head, twisting 180 degrees with a sickening sound of snapping vertebrae. The face was a blur of gray flesh, like a thumbprint rubbed into clay. It had no eyes, only 2 dark pits. "Turn around, turn around, turn around," it chanted. I fired the flare. The red ball of phosphorus hit the thing in the chest, igniting the moss and the gray skin. It let out a sound that I can only describe as 1,000 birds screaming at once. It dove into the water, and the clearing went dark again. I spent the next 6 hours in total darkness, drifting. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the splashing. Every time I drifted near the bank, I heard Maya's voice. I heard my mother's voice. I heard the voices of every friend I had ever lost, all of them begging me to come into the water. They weren't ghosts. They were something older, something that lives in the void spaces of the earth. They feed on identity. They take your voice, then your memories, and finally, they take your place. When the sun finally rose, I found myself back at the main dock. My boat was covered in a thick, black slime that smelled like old blood. I walked into the bait shop. My friend, Old Man Miller, looked at me and dropped his coffee cup. "Elias? What the hell? I just saw you walk out of here 5 minutes ago," he whispered, his face pale. I didn't say a word. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My reflection was there, but my eyes, they were starting to turn that sickly pale white. Somewhere out in the swamp, there is a version of me that sounds more like me than I do, and it's coming back. Most people think the backrooms are just an internet myth. But when the lights in Warehouse 404 started humming a melody my mother used to sing, I realized that some buildings aren't just made of bricks. They are made of traps. My name is Sarah, and I am an inventory auditor. My job is simple. I go into massive distribution centers at 2 a.m. when the shifts are thin and the silence is heavy, and I count what's left on the shelves. It's a job for people who like to be alone. Or at least I thought it was. Last Tuesday, I was assigned to the Blackwood Distribution Center in rural Pennsylvania. It's a 5 million square foot facility, a labyrinth of steel racking and cardboard boxes that stretches so far the other end of the building is lost in a gray haze. The air inside is always cold, smelling of ozone, dust, and dry paper. The floor manager, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s, handed me my scanner. "Stay out of section 12, he muttered, not looking me in the eye. "The motion sensors are glitchy there. You'll just get frustrated." I nodded, thinking it was just typical warehouse politics. But by 3:30 a.m., my scanner led me straight to the edge of section 12. I needed to verify a shipment of industrial sensors. The entrance to the section was marked by a flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed with a low, vibrating zzzzzt sound. As I stepped into the aisle, the sound changed. The hum of the lights started to harmonize. It sounded like a choir, thousands of miles away, singing a single mournful note. I ignored it and started counting. 1 box, 2 boxes, 3. I walked for 10 minutes, but when I looked back, the main corridor was gone. There was only the aisle, stretching behind me into total darkness. I checked my pedometer. I had walked nearly half a mile in a straight line. That was impossible. Section 12 was only 300 feet long. "Hello?" I called out. The sound of my voice didn't echo. It was swallowed instantly by the cardboard boxes. I turned around and started walking back, faster this time. My boots clicked on the concrete. Click, click, click. Then I heard a 4th click. Click, 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 click. I stopped. The 4th click happened a second after I stood still. It was heavy, like someone wearing steel-toed boots was walking just 5 feet behind me, perfectly mimicking my pace. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dust. The aisle was empty, but as I watched, a box on the 3rd shelf about eye level began to vibrate. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It looked like something inside was trying to breathe. The cardboard was expanding and contracting, slow and rhythmic. I didn't wait to see what was inside. I broke into a run. The aisle seemed to stretch as I ran. The faster I moved, the further away the end appeared. I passed the same dented red pillar 4 times. I was running in a loop, but the floor was perfectly straight. That's when the glitch happened. The rows of racking to my left and right began to melt. Not like ice, but like a digital image breaking apart. The boxes turned into gray static, and for a second, I could see through the walls of the warehouse. Beyond the walls wasn't Pennsylvania. It was nothing. A vast, white void that went on forever, filled with thousands of other rooms and aisles, all floating in a sea of static. I screamed and dove into the next aisle to avoid looking at the void. I landed hard on the concrete, my scanner skidding away. When I looked up, I wasn't in the warehouse anymore. I was in a hallway. It had the same yellow wallpaper, the same damp carpet smell, and the same buzzing lights from my childhood home. But there were no doors, just a hallway that turned at 90-degree angles over and over again. "Sarah? Is that you, honey?" The voice came from around the corner. It was my mother's voice, but my mother had been in a nursing home with advanced dementia for 3 years. She couldn't even say my name anymore. "Mom," I whispered, moving toward the corner. I turned the corner and stopped. It wasn't my mother. It was a creature made of the same yellow wallpaper. It had no face, only a mouth that was stitched shut with copper wire. It was wearing my mother's favorite floral dress, but the fabric was fused to its skin. It didn't walk. It slid across the carpet, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it moved, it made the sound of a dial-up modem, a screeching, digital whine that made my ears bleed. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah," it chanted, the voice coming from somewhere deep inside its chest. I turned and ran back the way I came, but the hallway was gone. I was back in the warehouse aisle, but the boxes were now piled 20 feet high, blocking my path. I started climbing. I scrambled over the cardboard, my fingernails tearing. I reached the top of the racking and looked down. The warehouse floor was gone. Below me was an ocean of black liquid, and thousands of faceless workers were wading through it. Their movements synchronized, their eyes glowing with that same sickly white light I had seen in my nightmares. One of them looked up. It was the manager who had given me the scanner. He smiled, and his mouth opened so wide his jaw snapped. "Welcome to the inventory, Sarah," he whispered. "We were short 1 unit." I felt a hand grab my ankle. I looked down, and the wallpaper creature was there, its wire-stitched mouth curling into a grin. Pulled. I fell. I woke up at 6 a.m., lying on the concrete floor of Section 12. The sun was coming up through the high windows. The lights were off. The manager was standing over me, looking disappointed. "Found you passed out," he said coldly. "Dehydration, probably. Go home." I scrambled to my feet and ran for the exit. I didn't look back until I was in my car. I checked my hand. My fingernails were still torn, and there was a small piece of yellow wallpaper stuck under my thumb. I went to visit my mother that afternoon. When I walked into her room, she looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you wearing that yellow dress? And why is your mouth sewn shut?" I looked in the mirror. I looked normal, but in my reflection, my mother wasn't there. There was only a stack of cardboard boxes, and the hum of the hospital lights was starting to sound like a melody. In the small mountain towns of Kentucky, they don't fear the dark. They fear the harvest. And when I saw the village elders gathering in the woods with iron masks and bone-carved knives, I realized I wasn't the guest. I was the offering. My name is Thomas, and I am a travel journalist. I've made a career out of finding hidden gems in the American South. But Oak Haven was a mistake I'll never be able to rectify. Tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Oak Haven doesn't appear on most maps. It's a town frozen in the 1800s, where the air smells of wood smoke and something sweet, like rotting peaches. I arrived at the local in just as the sun was setting. The owner, a man with skin like wrinkled leather, handed me a heavy iron bolt for my door. "Sun's down, son," he said, his eyes darting to the mountain peak. "Whatever you hear outside tonight, don't look. The mountain likes to watch back." I laughed, thinking it was just local folklore to scare tourists. I went to my room, set up my camera, and waited. Around midnight, the church bell rang. But it didn't ring 12 times. It rang 13. I looked out the window. The entire village, men, women, and children, were walking toward the woods. They were silent, moving in perfect unison. But they weren't wearing clothes anymore. They were draped in animal skins, and their faces were covered by masks made of rusted iron. Curiosity overrode my fear. I grabbed my camera and followed them into the brush. They gathered around a massive stone altar at the base of a jagged cliff. The rock wasn't gray. It was stained a deep, permanent crimson. In the center of the altar sat a young girl, but she wasn't crying. She was smiling, her eyes wide and vacant. The village elder, a man I recognized as the innkeeper, stepped forward. He held a knife made from a human femur. He didn't look at the girl. He looked directly at the bush where I was hiding. "The shadow has found a new voice," he whispered. I turned to run, but the trees had moved. The path I had taken was gone, replaced by a wall of thick, thorny briars that seemed to grow as I watched. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a hand that felt like cold, wet stone. I spun around. It was the girl from the altar, but she wasn't a girl anymore. Her skin was peeling back, revealing a hollow cavity filled with thousands of tiny, biting insects. "Don't be afraid, Thomas," she whispered, her voice echoing as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. "The mountain has been hungry for a long time. It remembers the taste of outsiders." I felt a sharp pain in my neck. The villagers were surrounding me, their iron masks glinting in the moonlight. As they pulled me toward the altar, I looked up at the mountain peak. It wasn't a mountain. It was a face. A massive, craggy face carved into the earth, and its mouth was slowly opening. I woke up the next morning in my bed at the inn. My camera was gone. My car keys were gone. When I looked in the mirror, there was a small, red mark on my neck, a symbol carved into my skin that looked like a mountain peak. I walked downstairs, and the innkeeper was there, frying bacon. He smiled at me, a warm, friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sleep well, Thomas?" he asked. "I need to leave," I stammered, rushing for the door. "You can't leave, son," he said, flipping a pancake. "You've been marked for the next harvest. And the mountain, it never forgets a face." I ran to my car, but when I looked at the GPS, the map was blank. There were no roads out of Oakhaven. There was only one road, and it led straight back to the altar. Now, I sit in my room, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The church bell is about to ring for the 13th time, and tonight I'm the one smiling,